This episode of America Fog of War is brought to you by Civil War Trails. Civil War Trails is the world's largest open-air museum, with over 1,300 sites to explore across 6 states. Drive the Gettysburg Campaign turn by turn, paddle past Frederick Douglass's birthplace, or hike to remote artillery positions. Follow Civil War Trails and create some history of your own. Visit civilwartrails.org to request a brochure today. If this is your first time listening to the show, you should know that this is the 3rd episode of our season covering the U.S. Civil War. If you like starting a story from the beginning, I'd recommend listening to episode 1 before continuing with this episode. If you don't mind jumping right in the middle of a story, then by all means, thanks for joining us. Now, on with the show. I am Colby Sumner, and this is America, Fog of War.
Pride of our nation. This day have set upon a mighty endeavor, the struggle to preserve our republic. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of...
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of it.
We're told that on his body was found a diary. Under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure.
I was 18 years old when I reported for boot camp, which, at the time of this recording, was 15 years ago now. And I can still remember it like it was yesterday. And looking back on it now, especially in light of the topics I'm covering in this episode, I'm able to realize, beyond all the culture shock that boot camp brings with it, all the yelling and the things that have made boot camp famous for generations, there are so many things happening in such a short amount of time, so efficiently. For instance, you are within seconds of being there, organized into groups and then subgroups, and given name tags, and you're sent over. You are given a haircut, but you also sent over to the doctor, and they get a physical on you, make sure they have a baseline of your health records, your status when you enter, so they have something to compare and contrast your health with throughout your career. They do that with the dentist as well. They take you over and they issue out your uniforms, all your gear, even your personal gear, things like toothbrush and toothpaste. They also issue you a weapon. They organize you into companies and then platoons and series, and then they give you your assigned drill instructors, and all of this happens within a matter of 3 days. It's honestly as though I was inserted into a machine of supreme efficiency. It's just like clockwork. And it makes me wonder how many generations of trial and error did it take to get the process of organizing new troops to this point. Because it hasn't always been the case that, when you joined a branch of the United States military, that you went through this process. There was a lot of steps to take along the way. And it's really where we are in this story that made me realize that in my own experience. Because, we're a volunteer force now. Well, back at the start of the country, service was compulsory. It was mandatory. If you were a military-aged male, you belonged to one of your, local militias, whether that was the state or the town level. You'd meet up once a month and for muster, and you'd do your marching and your shooting, and that would be that. When war came up, you'd go fight. But by the time of the Civil War, things had changed for militia. They had gone from being a compulsory organization to one that was voluntary, and had also gotten a reputation of not being very reliable. There was no more training going on. There was almost no discipline. Militia muster had turned into slang for a drinking party. Many professional military men felt at the time that they couldn't be trusted in combat. They would be used in the Mexican-American War, but almost to a man, they would not see combat because of that fact alone. William Tecumseh Sherman, who is going to be a huge character in this story, especially the further we get into it, will say something along the lines of using militia to put down the Southern Rebellion would be like trying to put out a fire with a squirt gun. So, not very much confidence from William Tecumseh Sherman on behalf of the militia. But for Lincoln and the rest of the North, the fact is that those militia units are the ones that answer Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops. But their service is short. Again, he asked for 3-month volunteers, and that had to do with what he was legally authorized to request from the public. But Lincoln knows he needs more volunteers, and he's going to need them with much longer commitment terms. So after his call for those 3-month volunteers, Lincoln will ask again in May for another 42,000 volunteers. But this time they're going to be 3-year volunteers. He's also going to ask to increase the size of the regular U.S. Army, and he's going to ask for 18,000 additional sailors as well. But he still needs more. In July, he's going to ask Congress to authorize 400,000 additional 3-year volunteers. Congress is going to approve 1 million. And by the time this war is over, it's close to that number that will have actually served in the Union Army. But just asking Congress for approval of these troops doesn't automatically put them in a formation in front of you. You've got to recruit them and you got to organize them. The reason I started out with my story of showing up to boot camp and witnessing this machine of supreme efficiency in action is because the process in this era was nothing like what we do today. And to give you an idea of how one of these 3-year regiments would be recruited and organized, it goes a little something like this. Someone popular in their state or town would open up a recruiting office. They'd start handing out flyers and letting all the young guys in the town know, or the state know, they were trying to organize a volunteer regiment. When they signed up 100 guys, they were formed into a company. Now, 10 companies would form a regiment, and that's going to be the primary tactical unit of the Civil War. On the modern battlefield, it's the squad or possibly the platoon that's the primary tactical unit, but it's a much smaller element. That's because we have a much greater capacity to put out firepower. It doesn't take as many guys to put as many rounds downrange as it did back then. But for the Civil War, it's going to be the regiment. That's 1,000 guys by the book, at least, ideally. Now, once that regiment was organized, the men would elect their company officers. That'll be captains and lieutenants. Those captains and lieutenants would then turn around and elect the regimental officers. That's the colonels, lieutenant colonels, and majors. And usually that's going to be the person that started and organized the recruitment of the regiment. They would be the ones usually elected to that top position. Now, this isn't something that we do nowadays. This is something that used to happen quite often back then. And it was because, again, like I had mentioned earlier, these regiments and companies are coming from the same place. They're all coming from the same town or the same county. They all know each other. And let's be honest, it's a little easier to volunteer to go fight a war if you know who you're going to be serving under versus being surprised when you get there. One thing I love to think about is, could you imagine this happening now? If after the September 11th attacks, famous people in our country started organizing their own volunteer regiments. I like to let my mind wander on things like this, and it cracks me up the possibilities that we could have ended up with. I mean, if, for instance, if The Rock, Dwayne Johnson or Elon Musk started recruiting volunteer regiments to go fight Al-Qaeda, I mean, you can have a lot of fun trying to come up with nicknames for those imaginary units that are similar to the ones you see in 1861. The units during the Civil War, these volunteer regiments, are going to have just amazing nicknames. I mean, just off the top of my head, something like the Rock's Brigade or Musk's Rebel Thrashers. I mean, I could do this all day. I could sit here and come up with funny little nicknames for these imaginary regiments. But the truth of the matter is that's really what's happening. Now, the electing of officers is something that happens on both sides, but mostly towards the beginning of the war. The reason that we get away from electing officers for combat troops and combat units is because it brings with it a ton of problems. The foremost of those problems is the discipline. They're not going to be going through a boot camp like I did. They're not going to be getting instilled with the institutional morals and values and discipline that all of our troops get nowadays. And a lot of them are going to have a hard time getting past the fact that the people now very much in charge of their lives just a few days before this were their equal on the street. On the other side of that, the officers that are getting elected to these positions are unwilling to enforce the discipline because they don't want to get voted out of their office, essentially. And when they go home, if they are a prominent politician or whatever the case is, they don't want that to affect their civilian life either. And as instinctual as fighting seems, and as smart as some of these guys are coming off the street, military strategy and leadership is something that you could spend a lifetime studying. Many people do. And these officers didn't know how to train or command soldiers. And at the start of this war, they will pay a heavy cost for that. But the process is so much different now than it was then. And it's because of the process that they had then that we ended up with what we have now. Throughout this war, it's going to begin to show the first glimpses of that machine that is so efficient now. And it's fascinating to watch for me. Now, real quick, I'm going to take a step back because I'm throwing a lot of unit nomenclature out there, and I want to make sure everybody is on the same page. I went over, what forms a company. You've got 100 guys in a company, then you got 10 of those makes a regiment. Again, that being the primary tactical unit of the Civil War. Well, there's going to be other categories of unit organizations, so I'm going to go through them real quick just so you have a little bit of a reference. But like we said earlier, 100 guys makes a company, 10 of those companies makes a regiment. And again, these numbers are by the book. As the war progresses, and relatively quickly at that, these numbers are going to drastically decrease in size. Now, you have your one regiment, that's 1,000 guys. 4 of those regiments will equal 1 brigade. 3 of those brigades will equal 1 division. 3 divisions will equal 1 corps. If you have 2 or more corps, that's an army. And there's also a few different types of units you could be in. Of course, there's the infantry, and that's your riflemen. That's what most people think of when they think of Civil War era combat, as these guys marching in formation to face off against each other in a long line of battle. You also have artillery. Then you have the cavalry, and cavalry specifically is special to this war because this is the last war the U.S. will be able to implement cavalry in a tactical way on the battlefield. After this, we get World War I, and cavalry will pretty much go extinct as the people in this era would understand it. Now, there will also be some differences between how the Union Army and how the Confederate Army handle cavalry. For instance, the Union government supplies horses to their cavalry units from the start of this war, whereas the South won't. They require that these guys provide their own mounts, their own horses, if they want to serve in the cavalry. And that does a few things. In the beginning of the war especially, for the Union, they end up getting terrible horses. Horses that aren't as fast, horses that aren't as prepared to handle the noise and stress of combat, a war horse essentially. They're usually the less capable beasts of burden. Some of the poor Union cavalry guys are going to be going into war on donkeys. And the Confederacy, on the other hand, the equestrian skill set is something that is a big part of life. And it's almost what separates classes in the South. You'll get this callback almost to the days of knights when you look at Confederate cavalry. And it's because of that reason alone. It's, most of the guys that are riding in these cavalry units are going to be from fairly wealthy families. But that's not always the case. I mean, there are going to be many, many instances of horse thievery because of this fact alone. But needless to say, the Confederacy is going to start out with a slight edge when it comes to the cavalry side of things. Now, the Confederacy recruited and organized their troops roughly the same way the Union did, but they're able to do so at the start of the war a little bit faster than the North, at least in some ways. And that's due to a few things. They're going to have huge numbers of volunteer companies, these militia companies, at the outbreak of the war, at least more so than the Union does right off the bat. Jefferson Davis will also beat Lincoln to the punch when it comes to requesting volunteers, making a call for those volunteers. Lincoln makes his first call in April. Jefferson Davis is going to call for 100,000 volunteers in March, and then he's going to ask for another 400,000 in May. There's also a huge military tradition in the South, and there are numerous military academies throughout the South during the 19th century, all of them training and preparing the next generation of college-aged men to lead troops in combat. Even William Tecumseh Sherman, who we mentioned just a little earlier, will be the commandant of one of these military academies. I believe it's in Mississippi, but I could be wrong on that. And it's what the South does with their trained or experienced military officers that sets them a little bit more apart from the North at the beginning of the war. But they're going to disperse their experienced officers throughout their entire army. Now, that's going to increase the quality and effectiveness of these brand new units in their training. And it's going to put experienced battlefield leaders in places where they can really make a difference and be effective when it comes to fighting this war. The Union Army, on the other hand, is going to keep most of its regular Army officers away from these new volunteer units that they've just inherited. And because of that, the Confederacy is going to be a little more equipped to handle land warfare at the start of this whole thing. But whatever military advantage the South had in its newly formed army is going to pale in comparison to the disadvantages it faces organizing a new navy. Now, the Confederate Navy will make incredible innovations in naval combat and warfare. Just off the top of my head, the CSS Virginia is going to be the first ironclad warship used in combat. Up to that point, it had been timber sailboats, and overnight, the CSS Virginia changes the naval game for every navy throughout the world. There's also the Hunley, which is the first submarine used in combat. I mean, this is an era where we're still using the horse as the primary mode of transportation, and you've got Confederate troops going into combat in a submarine. That's fascinating to me. But beyond these innovations, the truth is the Confederate Navy had to be built from scratch, and they didn't have really any capacity to compete with the North in the production of warships. Most of the facilities for building and repairing ships are in the North. Most of the people working a maritime trade also live in the North. The South has a massive obstacle when it comes to the naval side of things in this war, and it will really be a thorn in their side for the entire endeavor. Now, the Union Navy will be one of the foremost factors contributing to the outcome of the war. The Union Navy as a whole is going to be more experienced in their jobs than the Army. And what I mean by that is, most of these volunteers, these civilians that are just coming from everyday life and signing up for the war, are going to do so by joining the Army. But even more so, the volunteers that do decide to join the Navy are going to be coming from a maritime career. Guys that already know how to work and operate a vessel on the water. The only thing they have to learn how to do is fire artillery from it. That being said, they still have a ton of work to do to be able to meet the rapid mounting demands being put on their shoulders. Now, to start, they're going to convert civilian vessels to warships, and the North's overwhelming advantage in industrial capabilities allow them to do so quite rapidly. Now, those mounting demands that I had mentioned just a second ago for the U.S. Navy are due to the war strategy of their government. The Union's strategy for the war is titled the Anaconda Plan by newspapers at the time, and it's designed by General Winfield Scott, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. The plan called for a naval blockade of the Confederate coastline, seizing control of the Mississippi River, and then placing the South under siege with a combination of land and naval forces. And so the North needs a ton of ships to be able to do so. The Confederate strategy is a defensive one. Their idea or their goal, and much like the Patriots of 1776 and the Revolution, is to make the cost of the war too high. Take the North's will to fight the war from them because of how many lives have been sacrificed in pursuing the war. They're also hoping for a European intervention in the same way France intervened on our behalf during the Revolution. Well, both strategies contain assumptions that are going to prove to be large problems later in the war, but we'll get to that when the time comes. For a minute, I want to get back to that blockade. It sounds easy when I just skip across it, like, oh yeah, the entire coastline of the Confederacy needs to be put under blockade. Well, that's 3,500 miles of coastline. That's astronomical, and quite obvious that at the start of this whole thing, there are going to be large gaps in that blockade around the South. And for the Confederacy, this is an opportunity because in pitched naval battle, there's no competition for the U.S. Navy. They have to come up with some different strategies to win where they can. But the one strategy at the beginning of the war that the Confederate Navy found effective was commerce raiding or privateering. a strategy that hasn't really been seen since the golden age of sail with the European powers down in the Caribbean. And for those of you that don't know what commerce rating is, essentially what happens is Jefferson Davis will issue what's called a letter of marque, and this allows privately owned ships to raid Union supply vessels on behalf of the Confederate government. They also get to keep whatever they take from these ships. So oftentimes privateering is looked at as piracy. Well, these privateers that Jefferson Davis has just employed are right off the bat very effective against Union supplies and trade. And Lincoln has to deal with this. And this leads to a little bit of a showdown between Lincoln and Davis. Lincoln's going to announce the Union policy for handling these privateers. And he says, all right, you want to use privateers? If we capture them, we're going to hang them as pirates. And Davis responds by saying, all right, well, fine. Every privateer you execute, the Confederacy is going to execute a Union POW. Lincoln, weighing the outcomes of that standoff, decides to back off, but he still has to find a way to deal with these privateers and blockade runners because they're eating them up. This is when the Union naval strategy is going to shift its direction. See, at the outbreak of the war, the Union Navy only has 2 supply bases for the blockading fleet to operate out of. Again, remember, that coastline they have to cover is 3,500 miles. Well, those bases are hundreds of miles from the Confederate ports they've been charged with blockading. So most of these ships would spend just as much time traveling to and from their supply bases as they would actually blockading the ports they're assigned. So the Union Navy decides to do something about that. And they begin seizing several vital inlets and harbors along the southern coast. Now, they do this for a few reasons. One, to close them off to the blockade runners and the privateers that have been using them. And second, and probably more importantly, they're trying to give those blockade fleets additional and closer supply bases to utilize. And this leads us to some of the first Army-Navy joint operations of the war. And as a Marine, you know, I love amphibious landings. This is right up my alley. But in a very short amount of time, the Union is going to capture places like Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. And then the next step is Ship Island in Mississippi. Then Port Royal and the surrounding coastal islands in South Carolina. Even down in St. Augustine, Florida, Fort Pulaski, Georgia, and Roanoke Island in North Carolina. These are all going to be captured by Union forces and held for the remainder of the war. So already you start to see the overwhelming advantage that the North has in its naval capabilities. Another area that we need to look at, too, is financing this war. You know, money is what makes the wheels turn, essentially. You can't do any of this without the money to back it up. Now, the South, being a new nation, doesn't really have a financial system in place yet. And in the North, the federal budgets ran a deficit for 4 years in a row. The national debt is the highest it's been ever up to this point. And so to deal with this, both sides are going to print money. But because of a few decisions made, the South is going to see astronomical inflation throughout the war. If you were to look at a graph of inflation in the South from 1861 to 1865, it would look like a vertical line just about. In the North, they won't have that inflation. They decide to make their printed money, known as greenbacks, legal tender, and it really changes the game. But those long-term financial failures and successes are still far off for the people in this story. For now, the public pressure for these new armies to do something is building on both sides. Lincoln and the Union face another problem. The time on those 3-month volunteer commitments is running out, and once they run out, those guys are going home. The time to prepare has passed, and open combat is on the horizon. The soldiers of both armies are excitedly anticipating the glory of battle, but in just a short time, they'll realize horror is all that awaits them. And to put this into more eloquent words, I will quote James McPherson from his book Ordeal by Fire. He says this, quote, "Their vision was of bands, banners, and massed formations marching in brilliant sunshine to glorious victories, in which death, if it came, would be painless and honorable. Few could envisage the mud or choking dust, the bone-deep fatigue, the searing thirst and gnawing hunger, and the bitter cold or enervating heat of the march or bivouac, the boredom of camp life, the gut-tearing pain of dysentery, or the delirious ravings of typhoid in a primitive army hospital. The smoke, noise, confusion, and terror of battle, or the blood and screams and amputated limbs of the surgeon's tent. Even those who foresaw a long war could scarcely conceive of the massive mobilization of men and resources this war would require, or the savage destruction of men and resources it would cause." End quote.
Being a U.S. Marine and fighting for my country is one of the things in my life I am most proud of. Although there are so many positives that came from my experience in the Marine Corps, like many of you, I had another battle I had to fight when my service was done. It's no secret that PTSD affects many active duty and former servicemen and women every day, as well as their family members and the first responder community. If you or a family member is struggling with PTSD, Colby and I recommend looking into the Mighty Oaks Foundation for help in your battle with this condition. The Mighty Oaks Foundation is a faith-based veteran service organization that teaches combat veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress how to get beyond combat trauma and live their lives in the manner God intended. Many combat vets are unable to reintegrate back into civilian life, leaving their families to deal with the aftermath of broken homes and suicide at times. By aligning their lives to biblical principles, these warriors are able to lead their families, their communities, and our nation. Their mission is to serve and restore our nation's warriors and families who have endured hardship through their service to America, and to help them find a new life purpose through hope in Christ and their resiliency and peer-to-peer recovery programs. More than 4,000 alumni have participated in Mighty Oaks programs, as they maintain one of the highest success rates of any recovery program in preventing veteran suicide and divorce. In fact, their programs are so successful that they receive hundreds of active duty military on official orders each year. Additionally, through a proactive effort, Mighty Oaks has provided resiliency programs to over 150,000 active duty troops on military bases worldwide. Find more information on the Mighty Oaks Foundation by visiting americafogofwar.com and follow the link Mighty Oaks Foundation located in the menu at the top of the homepage. Never fight alone. Get some backup in your fight with PTSD today.
Civil War combat is one of those areas in history that I find riveting for so many reasons. One of those reasons is that it's like watching a science experiment conducted on the methods of warfare. Historian James McPherson makes the point that the Civil War is the midpoint, or that space in the timeline where a transition is taking place between traditional warfare, and that'd be like the Napoleonic battles fought in Europe. Both sides in brightly colored uniforms. They're formed up in battle lines. They got smoothbore muskets that have very short effective ranges. And the whole experience is cloaked in glory, like on to war, on to glory kind of thing. And it's transitioning to the era of modern warfare, what all of us nowadays are more used to seeing. That'd be like in the World Wars, or even what we see in Iraq and Afghanistan. Weapons that can be effective over vast distances. War being waged on enemy economies and infrastructure, as well as enemy troops. In an active media that distributes the real sights of war to the public, not just paintings, as they had been up to this point. Up to this point in history, a soldier's experience could be confined to the description I gave of traditional warfare. And after the Civil War, their experience would be that of the modern warfare description. But for the soldiers fighting during this transitional period, their experience would be a combination of both. They would march to meet the enemy in lines of battle while under fire from extremely accurate weapons that were devastating over much greater distances than before. They would believe in the glory of war until confronted with the devastation the war had on the lives of those waging it and the economies that supported them. And the thing about a period of transition is there's a learning curve for everyone involved. The common soldier had to learn how to implement those new weapons effectively and survive a fast and quickly accelerating battlefield, while the officers in command of these soldiers had to learn how to use their forces effectively without getting everyone killed. The first major battle in this war happens at a place called Manassas in Virginia, and it seems to me to be the first glimpse the people living in this era get of what warfare is going to be like during this transitional phase. To set the stage for this battle, you should know the main Union force, commanded by a guy named Irvin McDowell, is still in Washington, D.C. It's where it's been since the start of the war. And the main Confederate force is directly to their south at a small town that was little more than a rail depot at the time, called Manassas. They are under the command of a guy we talked about in the last episode of America Fog of War, PGT Beauregard. He was the commander of the Confederate forces in Charleston during the attack on Fort Sumter. And by this point in our story, he's commanding a force of roughly 22,000 men. Now, McDowell, the commander of the Union force in D.C., has more men than Beauregard, around 35,000, and like anybody would in his position, he wants to use that to his advantage. But he has a problem. Over in the Shenandoah Valley, which is basically the western boundary of Virginia, it's about 60 miles away from where Beauregard is in Manassas. You have another Confederate army, and their numbering are somewhere around 12,000 men. And they're under the command of an experienced officer named Joseph Johnston. Now, if Johnston is able to reinforce the Confederates at Manassas, McDowell will lose his numerical advantage and very well may lose the battle. The one good thing McDowell does have going for him, though, is there is another Union force also over in the Shenandoah Valley, and they're around 18,000 men strong and just north of Johnston and his Confederates. The commander of that Union force is a guy named Robert Patterson, who, although is experienced, is also very old and a little past his prime as a commander. So if we look at this like a fist fight, McDowell and his buddy Patterson, they're out on the town for a night, and they bump into a few guys from the rival town, a few towns over, Beauregard and Johnston. Some words are exchanged, and a fight breaks out. Now, McDowell would be the most dangerous one on his own. He's the biggest, he can punch the hardest, and if it's just a one-on-one fight with the guy in front of him, that's Beauregard, the fight would be over in a matter of minutes, with Beauregard on his back, knocked out, asleep. But that's only if it's a one-on-one fight. If Beauregard's friend Johnston decides to ignore the guy in front of him, and that would be Patterson in this case, who is a little older, he's kind of timid and really not looking for a fight in the first place. If Johnston decides to ignore him and instead runs over to help out Beauregard, making it a 2-on-1 fight, McDowell is in a lot of trouble. I hope the little example I just gave you somewhat painted a clearer picture of the situation these commanders found themselves in. And if you're wondering why Patterson couldn't just do what they were afraid of Johnston doing, scoot over there to Manassas and bulk up the Union side, kind of guaranteeing the numerical advantage for the Union forces, the answer is he can't. Patterson and his men are much further away from Manassas than Johnston and his Confederates. Without a route or means of moving there fast enough, if he did attempt that, by the time he got there, the fight would be over. So it's very important for McDowell not to let that happen. To do that, he's going to tell Patterson, hey, listen, you can't let Johnston leave the Shenandoah Valley. You got to keep him engaged enough so that he can't slip away and reinforce Beauregard at Manassas. I'll move down, I'll attack Beauregard, and once I finish up taking care of the Confederates there, I'll make my way over towards the valley, and together we'll finish off Johnston and his forces. Easy day in the office. The unfortunate reality for McDowell and the Union is that Beauregard knows McDowell is coming. He's got a pretty intricate spy ring considering how early on this is in the war, all throughout Northern Virginia, even into Washington, D.C., and he's very, very much aware of what McDowell's plans are. He also is going to send word to General Johnston over in the Shenandoah Valley telling him to bring his forces to Manassas to reinforce and strengthen his own numbers, Beauregard's numbers. And Patterson fails to keep him pinned up in the Shenandoah Valley. Johnston is able to slip away. This is the first big swing of luck favoring the Confederates in this campaign. Now, one thing that's pretty interesting, as I said, this is a transitional time frame, and there are going to be things done throughout this war that have never been done before in the history of the world. One of those things is when Johnston moves his men from the Shenandoah Valley over to Manassas Junction, he does so by using trains and railroads, which is the first time in the history of the world that combat troops were transported to the front line of battle by railroad. And it seems pretty simple, but the truth is he has just cut the time of those troops getting there down to a fraction of what it would have been. Before that, it was as fast as those troops can march is when they would get there. Now they're there as quickly as a train can get them there. For McDowell, the bad luck seems to continue to mount. He moves out of Washington, D.C., and his goal is to make it to a town called Centerville, which is the last major town you would hit on your way to Manassas if you're coming from D.C. It's a distance of 22 miles from Washington, D.C., but because everybody is new, and because these officers that are in charge of these brigades and divisions, even McDowell himself, none of them have ever commanded forces this large in numbers, the march from D.C. to Centerville is going to take 2.5 days, and it's going to be a mess. Guys are going to be throwing gear off to the side of the road. They're going to be hopping out of formation to go pick berries and take a nap, or anything else you can think of is happening on this march. But eventually they make it to Centerville, which brings us to the morning of July 21st, 1861, the day of the battle. Now, to understand best what's going to happen, it helps to know a little bit about the terrain in and around Manassas. It's mostly wide rolling hills with small patches of trees and underbrush scattered here and there. There's a creek called Bull Run that flows along its border on the same side McDowell's army is approaching from. There are a handful of crossing points over the creek. The most accessible is a stone bridge, which is still there today. Now, by this time, there's already been a few initial skirmishes, which are gunfights on a smaller scale, not open battle like what's getting ready to happen. And McDowell has also been sending out reconnaissance patrols pretty much nonstop. So he has a pretty good picture of the enemy's position by the time he begins planning his attack. He's found out that the left flank, that'd be the left side, of the enemy defensive line is at the stone bridge, defending it from Union troops using it to cross Bull Run. Now from there it continues to the south, defending a number of other crossing points along Bull Run Creek. At around 5:15, McDowell launches an attack at several of those crossing points, including the stone bridge. But it's a feint attack, or a fake attack. It's a trick to keep the Confederates' attention focused there. His actual attack is going to be executed by a column of over 10,000 men conducting a flanking march to the north of the stone bridge. They're going to cross Bull Run Creek at a place called Sudley Ford, out of sight completely of the Confederates, and attack behind the left side of the rebel defensive line, ideally rolling it up like a carpet as they continued moving southward. But the problem is there are massive delays with that flanking column. Those Union troops woke up at 2 a.m. that morning and began their march. Now, because they're new, again, like I had mentioned earlier, it's dark out, and when I say dark, it's extremely dark. They're in unfamiliar territory, and even things down to like the order of march leaving Centerville that morning caused delays. One of the divisions that's in charge of doing the feint attack on the stone bridge is marching in front of the flanking column that's supposed to be making their way north. And the flanking column has a much further distance to cover. And you'd think they would start out in the front, but because of that, they're held up and they are going to be hours behind schedule. The lead elements of the flanking column won't start crossing Sudley Ford until about 9:30 in the morning. A whole 5.5 hours or so after those feint attacks had been initiated along the eastern portion of Bull Run. Now, McDowell took the initiative. He's dictating the time and place of battle because he started out first. And so far, with the exception of some of those delays and some of the issues that they're running into, his plan seems to be working. But like I mentioned in episode 1 of this season, fate has a funny way of intervening in history. And a young Confederate officer, the chief of the Signal Corps for Beauregard's army there in Manassas Junction, wakes up that morning and goes out to one of his numerous signaling platforms. They're these wooden towers they would build so that they could send signals back and forth to other towers spread out across this large area around Manassas Junction. They would do so in a system called wigwag. It's actually a system that this young signal officer had invented. They use flags, and the pattern of the flags they would use, or the type of flag they would use, would mean different things, and they would be able to pass fairly basic messages on to the other parts of the battlefield. It would be quicker than trying to send a courier on horseback. Well, he gets up on this observation platform and starts checking the numerous signal stations that he has to see if there's any signal being transferred to him or to anybody else on the battlefield. This young officer's name is Edward Porter Alexander. In his personal memoir of his time in the Civil War is among the best firsthand accounts we have today. And what happens next is a plot twist as good as the best Hollywood's ever written. So much so that it would be an injustice for me to try to put it into my own words, so I'll let Edward Porter Alexander tell you what happened next. Quote, I exchanged messages with all the stations when I got on Wilcoxon's Hill and fixed my glass on the Stone Bridge station, looking for the earliest developments there. And while looking at them, as well as I remember, about 8:30 a.m., suddenly a little flash of light in the same field of view, but far beyond them, caught my eye. I was looking to the west, and the sun was low in the east. This flash was the reflection of the sun from a brass cannon in McDowell's flanking column, approaching Sudley Ford. It was about 8 miles from me in an air line, and was but a faint gleam, indescribably quick. But I had a fine glass and well-trained eyes, and I knew at once what it was. Careful observation also detected the glitter of bayonets all along a road crossing the valley, and I felt sure that I was onto McDowell's plan. I determined to be very exact in my reports. First, I signaled to Evans as of most immediate consequence. Evans is the commander of Confederate forces stationed over at the Stone Bridge. And he said this to him, quote, look out for your left, you are flanked. And then wrote a note for General Beauregard by courier as he was not near a station. And I wrote this, I see a column crossing Bull Run about 2 miles above Stone Bridge. Head of it is in woods on this side. Tail of it is in woods on other side. About a 1/4 mile length of column visible in the opening. Artillery forms part of it. End quote. I mean, isn't that incredible? That's a crazy plot twist in the development of this story. McDowell's plan is working. He's tricking the enemy, and he's going to surprise them, but all of a sudden Alexander sees a indescribably quick flash of light 8 miles away from him using mid-19th century binoculars, and he changes the entire course of the day. Like I said, fate intervenes when it wants to, and when it does, the plot twists it produces are some of the best ever. Like I mentioned earlier, the commander of the Confederate forces defending the Stone Bridge that Alexander sent a signal message to is a guy known by his nickname Shanks Evans. He's a colonel, and I believe that nickname had something to do with him being a rather big guy and tall, with legs too skinny for his frame. And even if that's not how the nickname originated, Evans is a colorful character anyways. He's a guy that always has a keg of his favorite whiskey with his headquarters so that he can drink from it whenever he wants to. And from my understanding, that was very often. It's also said that he had a very fiery personality and enjoyed fighting any chance he could, with whoever he could. That's including even his commanding officers sometimes. Now, Evans has been watching the Union attack in front of the Stone Bridge all morning and has started suspecting that things weren't as they seemed. When he's handed the message Alexander had sent warning of the flanking column crossing Sudley Ford, he knows he has to do something to slow them down so the rest of the Confederate troops who are on the opposite end of Manassas can have time to get the news and move to meet the advancing Federals. Now, Evans only has 1,100 men and a few cannon with him at the Stone Bridge, and he can't leave the bridge completely unguarded. So in a move that reminds me of the famous last stand of Leonidas and the Spartans at the hot gates of Thermopylae, Evans takes 900 of his men and runs to confront the advancing enemy force. 10,000 Union soldiers clash with those 900 Confederates on a hill called Matthews Hill. And for me personally, it's scenes like this that I find the most awe-inspiring. It shows what humans are capable of facing, the courage they are able to exemplify even in the most terrifying situations. It's something I truly find incredible. And although very brave, they were very near disaster not long into the start of this thing, because the unfortunate reality is a numerical advantage with a ratio so one-sided is going to have an effect. But just as things seem to be slipping out of Evans's grasp, 2 more Confederate brigades show up to reinforce him on Matthews Hill, bringing the total number of Confederate troops fighting on Matthews Hill to 4,500. Now that's great, but they're still facing an enemy of over 10,000 men strong. And for almost 2 hours, the outnumbered Confederates are going to halt the advance of the Union flanking column. And throughout those 2 hours, there will be accounts of bravery on both sides. For example, there will be a Confederate Zouave regiment. Now, Zouave regiment is modeled after the French Zouaves, but they wear the baggy pantaloons and the fez-style caps into battle. Well, this Confederate Zouave regiment that, as a part of their gear, carry with them Bowie knives, like Jim Bowie from the Alamo, famous knife fighter. These Confederates will charge the Union line, and when they do, it's said that they were so amped up from the rush of battle that they dropped their rifles and charged the Northern soldiers wielding those Bowie knives alone. I mean, that's crazy. And it's incredibly brave. And while that is admirable, and I'm sure extremely intimidating to see running at you, it's something that would have worked in the era before this one, that traditional Napoleonic era of warfare. But as I've been saying, these guys are in that transitional period of warfare and find out the hard way that they can't get away with doing that kind of stuff anymore. This all goes back to that learning curve that I talked about earlier. The decision to charge the enemy without rifles costs them unbelievable casualties and compromises the strength of the Confederate line. Eventually, another column of Union troops arrive at Matthews Hill. They had pushed the small 300-man group of Confederates Evans left behind off of the stone bridge and were crossing into the battle in large numbers at this point. All of those factors end up causing the small Confederate line on Matthews Hill to break. And that fracture eventually becomes a disorganized retreat, and those Confederates will move toward a hill a mile south of Matthews Hill called Henry Hill. A place where legends will be born in this battle. It's no secret that Brett and I have been friends since we were 18 and in the first year of our enlistments. Well, a few years ago, we decided that we needed to see each other with more consistency than we had been up to that point. But it would have to be a trip of some kind because we lived on opposite ends of the country. For us, there was no better way to spend our time together than being out on one of the many battlefields all across the country. We would take 2 trips a year, each of them just for a few days, and go park the car, get out, and walk a battlefield like Antietam or Gettysburg. And we'd have a blast. It's on one of those trips we decided to start America Fog of War. Walking America's battlefields in the footsteps of the men that fought the battle is the best way to learn the legacy of the American warrior and to really appreciate the sacrifices they made. Brett and I both still do it, and although it's usually for researching the subject matter of our show these days, it's still fun. If you're interested in following the Army of Northern Virginia's invasion into Maryland, or its retreat after the defeat at Gettysburg, or Grant's 1864 Overland Campaign, then I highly recommend checking out Civil War Trails. I've been a fan of Civil War Trails and what they do since Brett and myself started doing these battlefield trips all those years ago. They're an awesome organization. They make the historical interpretation of the American warrior's legacy easier to access and enjoy for everyone. If you'd like more information on Civil War Trails and what they do and all the different sites that they have for you to explore, then go check out civilwartrails.org. Find a battlefield or a site that you want to visit and stand in the footsteps of the men and women that made this country what it is today. Now, so far the day is going very well for McDowell and the Union forces. His plan is working. The small Confederate force guarding the stone bridge had been forced to withdraw, allowing more Union brigades to enter the battlefield, and the little resistance the flanking column encountered had been dealt with on Matthews Hill. Complete victory for the Union was not far from being secured. But they still had one more place to go, and that was Henry Hill. So McDowell orders his artillery forward to the northern slope of Henry Hill. They'll be accompanied by a handful of infantry, but not that many. And as they crest the hill, they're greeted by the boom of Confederate cannons just 300 yards in front of them. And for those of you that don't realize, that is point-blank range when we're talking about artillery. These Union troops are going to have to unlimber their cannon and get their guns ready to return fire under hellacious incoming volleys. They're facing off against 13 Confederate cannons. And at such a close range, the Confederate artillery is at an advantage. That's because they're smoothbore cannons. They're Napoleonic-style cannons. The Union Army is using rifled artillery, and what I mean by that is if you've ever looked inside the barrel of a gun of any kind, typically you will see these grooves, these spiral grooves that go down the barrel. That puts spin on whatever kind of round you're putting through that barrel, and it allows it to go further and more accurately at that. So over long distance, rifled artillery is much more advantageous. But over a short distance, up close, the smoothbore artillery is deadly, and that's because of the type of rounds they can fire. Those Confederate guns, those smoothbore guns, are firing something called canister rounds. And essentially, it's a shotgun round on steroids. A shotgun round has a ton of BBs inside of it, and when it's fired and leaves the barrel, those BBs spread, and they hit a wide area. So try this. Picture a shotgun shell big enough to be fired by one of these cannons. For the most part, the Confederates are using 12-pounder Napoleons with a caliber that's the diameter of the bore of the barrel, like the actual hole that the round comes out of. It has a diameter of over 4.5 inches. One of these shotgun shells, these canister rounds that would be fired out of these cannons, weighs almost 15 pounds. And encased inside those canister rounds were almost 30 golf ball-sized iron balls. That sounds terrifying. And on top of their advantage with artillery, the Confederate position on Henry Hill will make the next few hours for the Union an absolute nightmare. Those 13 Confederate cannon are positioned on the reverse slope of Henry Hill, and they're put in just the right spot so the gunners could fire their round. The recoil of that round being fired would roll the cannon backwards further down the reverse slope of the hill, where the gunners could reload the cannon, for the most part, out of harm's way. And if that wasn't enough, when the gunners rolled their cannon forward back up the slope of the hill and prepare to fire at the advancing Union troops, their field of fire is very wide and almost completely unobstructed. Is this starting to sound like hell on earth for the Union soldiers to you? Or is that just me? The Union troops on Henry Hill have to do something to gain an advantage over the Confederates and get themselves out of the situation they're in. So one of the Union artillery battery commanders, a captain, decides to make a risky move for just that reason. And what happens is a tragically sad story that highlights so many problems the troops on this battlefield in particular faced because everyone involved in this fight was inexperienced. This Union battery commander is in charge of 5 cannons, which would have all been positioned together on Henry Hill. He orders 2 of those cannons to limber up, get their cannons attached to their horses, and then move around Henry Hill to flank the Confederate artillery. And that's a term I've already used quite a few times in this episode and will use many more times throughout this season. So let me explain that a little bit for those of you that are wondering what to flank the enemy means. The goal of flanking enemy forces on the battlefield is to move around to the side of that force and hit them from a second area. That's typically either the side or the rear of that enemy force. It's a miserable place to find yourself in. I have been caught in a few L-shaped ambushes where you're getting hit from the front and the side simultaneously, and it's hard to find cover to get behind. It's hard to find something that will protect you from both the front and one of your sides. Also, it's hard to return fire on 2 separate fronts. It also cuts off sometimes the route of retreat or the avenue of egress for that force that's just been flanked, especially if the enemy is able to make it to their rear. So getting out's not necessarily an option at that point. It's a fundamental tactic of warfare, and this captain is trying to employ it against the Confederate artillery on Henry Hill. He wants to get those 2 cannon positioned on the left side of the Confederate artillery, putting them under artillery fire from their front and their side, which the captain hoped would force the Southern troops off of the hill and into a full-scale retreat. Once the cannon made it to their new position and unlimbered their guns, they noticed a body of troops emerging from the woods behind the Confederate artillery line. The Union cannons began preparing to fire at that body of troops, but are told to stop by the chief of artillery for the Union Army. He tells them not to fire because those soldiers are friendly soldiers there to support those two cannons. He thinks this because that formation of soldiers is wearing blue uniforms. Unfortunately for the Union chief of artillery, this is the first major battle of the war, and one of the problems that stem from that is there is no standard uniform for either side. And at this battle, there are Northern troops wearing gray uniforms, Southern troops wearing blue uniforms, some troops on both sides wearing uniforms that feature red pants or hats, and many other colored uniforms everywhere in between. The formation of troops that has emerged from the woods in front of the Union cannons are Confederates that are wearing blue uniforms, who were not moving to support those cannons, but were charging them. When the blue-clad Confederates got to within a sickeningly close distance, they stopped, aimed their rifles, and fired a volley into the Union artillerists, and it leveled almost all of them. The handful of Union men that do survive that volley were forced to leave their guns and their dead and dying comrades where they were. They had to escape the Confederate charge that followed that volley. And with the guns abandoned, those charging Confederates took control of them with the intention of using them on their former owners. Those Confederate troops belonged to Virginia's 1st Brigade. They are one of the units that came from the Shenandoah Valley, and the story of how they ended up at their spot on Henry Hill is kind of like the origin story for the first legend born in this battle. That would be the guy in charge of Virginia's 1st Brigade. He's a West Point graduate, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and was an instructor at the Virginia Military Institute before the Fort Sumter crisis took place. He's actually at John Brown's execution as part of the security detail. He's commanding students from VMI who are manning 2 cannon. Now, earlier that day, they were positioned where the majority of the Confederate troops were, way on the other side of the battlefield. And I've made the point many times that almost all of the guys there that day were anxious for their chance to get into the fight. But the commander of Virginia's 1st Brigade isn't like most of the guys in either army. He isn't just anxious or excited to get into the fight. This guy will become widely known for being incredibly aggressive in battle. To give you an idea of just how aggressive he is, just before the war starts, he'll be talking to someone about what he believed the strategy should be for the Southern forces in their pursuit of this war. His advice was to, and I quote, "draw the sword and throw away the scabbard." His men will be quoted numerous times saying that this awkward guy from the mountains of Virginia, who, if you described as reserved in his everyday interactions, would be an exaggeration of his personality. That as soon as he was in the heat of battle, though, this passive, blunt, very reserved man would become electric with excitement. They would say that his eyes, he had apparently these very blue eyes, they would say that they would almost glow. He was so charged up. His eyes would be commented on more so than anything else that I've found, and by many different people when talking about this commander's presence in combat. So they had to have been quite captivating. And on the morning of the battle, he and his brigade have been placed way behind where the Confederate leaders think the front line of the battle will be. They've been placed there in reserve, which is a necessary thing to have in a battle. If you're the commanding general of an army, you don't want to commit all of your forces into the fight. You want to have some in reserve to plug holes in the line where you need to and replace units that have had heavy casualties and things like that. But if you want to fight as badly as the commander we've been talking about does, that's the worst place to be. You might miss the fight entirely. Well, at some point, this brigade commander gets word of the fighting taking place on Matthews Hill and decides that that's enough of a green light for him. That's all he needed to get into the fight. And without orders, he's not even going to send off with a courier to ask permission or forgiveness. He's just going to pick up and go. He's going to send his guys on a march in the direction of that fight, and he's going to do it at almost a sprinting pace. He and the men of Virginia's 1st Brigade will get to Henry Hill just in time to see the chaos of the Confederate retreat from Matthews Hill. But instead of thinking the fight was over and the day lost, the commander of Virginia's 1st Brigade decides he's going to fight. He places his 13 artillery pieces, the same 13 cannon I talked about a little earlier, on the crest of the reverse slope. And a little further down the reverse slope, inside the trees, he places his infantry regiments in lines of battle and tells them all to lay on their bellies so they were out of sight of the Union troops advancing towards them. And it's one of those infantry regiments that belonged to Virginia's 1st Brigade, laying on their stomachs in the tree line, that's just captured those 2 Union cannons. And at around the same time those cannons are taken, this brigade commander, an insignificant unknown officer, essentially, will be catapulted past famous to living legend status. The catalyst of this ascendancy is a sentence that's no more than 10 words, but will be one of the most famous sentences spoken throughout the entirety of the war. One of the commanders from the fight on Matthews Hill, a general named Bernard B., is at this point in the battle trying to rally his men and inspire them to get back into the fight. The Confederate troops that had retreated from Matthews Hill were still very disorganized and I imagine not too anxious to re-engage with Union forces. So while B is trying to motivate his guys, he'll point up at the commander of Virginia's 1st Brigade on top of Henry Hill, and he will say those 10 words. He says this, quote, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians," end quote. The commander of the Confederates holding Henry Hill is Thomas Jackson. But because of that sentence, he will be forever known as Stonewall Jackson. And he is the kind of general that only comes along once in a lifetime. He is tactically brilliant and, like I said, extremely aggressive. And because of his zealous belief that he and his brigade were an army of the living God, he had the nerve to operate in battle ways that other commanders would be far too nervous to attempt. He was deeply religious, so much so that he wouldn't even send letters home if there was a chance they'd have to be transported on a Sunday. Now, that being said, he did have no qualms fighting on Sundays, just to point out how he separated his faith from his duties. Now, General McDowell, the Union Army commander, knows he has to do something and calls on one of the regiments he has in reserve. He orders this regiment, the 14th Brooklyn, to countercharge Stonewall Jackson's Confederates that are now in possession of those Union cannon. The New Yorkers advanced so quickly they were able to get as close as 40 yards from the rebels before opening fire on them. I mean, just think about how close that really is for a minute. 40 yards. It's less than half a football field. Close enough that it could go without saying that the 14th Brooklyn levels the Confederates. After firing that volley, the New Yorkers closed the distance and knocked the remaining rebels off of those captured guns. The Virginians retreating past the woods they emerged from just before this, which is Jackson's defensive line where the rest of their brigade still is. And that's a problem. Because of that, the next Confederate infantry regiment in that defensive line is suddenly exposed and very vulnerable on their left flank to the advancing New Yorkers. The commander of that regiment tried to turn some of his troops to do what we call refuse his left flank, and basically he attempted to bend back the left side of his line to face the New Yorkers. For a visual, it would look similar to the shape of a capital L. Now, unfortunately, his men are also new, and they misunderstand the command, and instead of turning to fight the advancing New Yorkers, they begin falling back with the other men that are retreating past them. Jackson has, up to this point, been very successful in holding the Union forces back, but his left flank was disintegrating right before his eyes, and the rest of his line was in danger of being rolled up. And instead of pursuing the fleeing Confederate infantry in front of them, the 14th Brooklyn have turned and are advancing on the line of rebel artillery in front of those woods.
which to them seemed pretty vulnerable because they couldn't see any kind of infantry support near those guns. And Jackson sees everything that's going on, but he's not worried. He's already prepared for this. Remember, only 2 regiments from Jackson's brigade have retreated. He still has a few more positioned in those woods behind his artillery. They're laying on their bellies, and they're hidden from the men in the 14th Brooklyn. Jackson orders 2 of his remaining regiments to stop the advance of the 14th Brooklyn. He'll say this, quote, "Reserve your fire until they come within 50 yards. Then fire and give them the bayonet. And when you charge, yell like furies." End quote. The 14th Brooklyn continued moving toward the center of Jackson's line and were met with the first Confederate volley. And it's a deadly combination of artillery and small arms fire, and it's going to momentarily stagger them. And after a few minutes, the officers need to be able to get everybody reorganized and reform their very thinned out lines at this point. The New Yorkers begin advancing again. And again, they are met with a brutal volley from the Confederates. The 14th Brooklyn will attack the Confederate line for a 3rd time, and I love the way historian S.C. Gwynn, in his book Rebel Yell, describes what happens to them when they do. He says this, quote, "Undeterred and acting more like veterans than the green troops they were, they attacked a 3rd time, many of them this time coming within just a few feet of Jackson's line in a loud and savagely close fight. They paid for it. At such short range, the Virginians cut them to pieces. The Yankee battle line faltered, stood as though frozen for a moment in the swirling eddies of smoke, and then broke." End quote. It's hard to imagine any troops, green or experienced veterans, that would be capable of withstanding such brutal violence. Taking a volley from both infantry and artillery at a distance of just a few yards is something I'm glad I've never had to personally experience. Because of that 3rd volley, the 14th Brooklyn begins to fall back toward the rest of the Union Army. And it's at this point in the story that another Civil War legend is born. After that volley is fired, Jackson orders his men to charge the retreating troops. And again, I'm going to let S.C. Gwynn describe what happens next. Quote, "Obeying their orders and screaming like whatever they conceived the Furies to be, Jackson's Virginians swept straight out of the woods towards the retreating enemy and toward those lethal Federal batteries on the far edge of Henry Hill. The peculiar, piercingly loud noise the advancing men made was something neither rebel nor Union troops had heard before, and whose exact inspiration was unknown. It was the implausible result of each man giving a sequence of 3 sounds that registered somewhere between the screech of a bird and the bark of a fox. A short, high-pitched yelp, followed by a short, lower-pitched bark, followed by a long, high-pitched yelp. Collectively, the noise sounded feral, unearthly, and inhuman, like an ululation from the pit of hell. It would become the stuff of Union nightmares throughout the war. As one Federal soldier put it, there is nothing like it on this side of the infernal region. The peculiar corkscrew sensation it sends down your backbone can never be told. The practice would spread throughout the entire Confederate Army, and it would soon have a name, the Rebel Yell." End quote. The Rebel Yell will be given on almost every battlefield throughout the war after this moment, and it will spark fear in everyone that hears it. The battle for control of Henry Hill would continue for a few more hours, with Union forces assaulting the Confederate line repeatedly, and the rebels repeatedly repulsing them. The fighting throughout this portion of the battle will be almost exclusively conducted at close range. So close, in fact, that one of the most nightmarishly terrifying encounters an infantryman can face in combat happens during this window of time, and that's hand-to-hand combat. I don't have the authority to speak for all infantrymen out there, but I don't think it's inaccurate or any kind of misrepresentation to say that no one wants to experience that. Nobody. We're not just talking about a few bayonet wounds happening, but a vicious, animalistic fight for survival. Where not just bayonets are used to kill, but heavy wooden rifle stocks being swung like baseball bats. The slamming of large rocks to crush enemy bones and flesh. Teeth, fists, and even strangulation would all be weapons of war in that kind of a situation. And it's all happening in a space close enough that the last breath of a dying soldier could be felt on the face of the man killing him. It's an experience that I hope I would never have to face. I hope no one else ever has to face. It's possibly one of the worst experiences you can have here on Earth. It's one that even the most seasoned combat veterans would have incredible difficulty facing, and the guys on Henry Hill are green. At around 4 p.m., General McDowell organizes a final assault against the Confederate position on Henry Hill. And this assault will send the rebels that have been so successful for all this time fleeing into the woods and off of the hill. And federal troops are going to be cheering, they're celebrating. They think they've won the day, they think they've had a victory. And keep in mind, these guys have either been marching or fighting for 12 hours by this time. So that overwhelming relief, combined with the physical and mental exhaustion they had to be feeling, was probably almost crippling. General McDowell will notify Lincoln of his victory by telegraph around 4:30, not knowing that behind the trees lining Henry Hill, the ones where all the rebels had just fled to, lurked disaster. The fighting on Matthews Hill and Henry Hill gave Beauregard and Johnston incredibly valuable time to make adjustments. And as those Confederates are retreating from that final Union assault and enter the safety of the woods, the retreat is brought to a halt by what they see in front of them. It's the fruits of Beauregard and Johnston's efforts. All the brigades staged on the other side of Manassas since earlier that morning, and the last of the brigades traveling from the Shenandoah Valley, were all there in front of them, formed up to countercharge the Federal troops. Those fresh Confederate troops erupted from the woods, surprising the exhausted Union soldiers. And as the fear of the reality charging them replaces the disbelief they must have been feeling, the Federals begin to break, and they start falling back in retreat. And within a matter of minutes, that retreat devolves into absolute panic and chaos. Union soldiers are going to be fleeing for their lives in an every man for himself kind of a situation. And something I should point out here, there's something very unusual that takes place in this battle, but it's the presence of civilian spectators. People from Washington, D.C. have ridden their carriages down to Manassas to have picnics and watch the fight unfold. There are even some congressmen there watching the battle. And as this panicked flight sweeps over the battlefield, those civilians become caught in the chaos too. In her book, Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin describes the scene like this, quote, "A sudden swoop and a body of Confederate cavalry rushed down upon our columns. They came from the woods, and infantry poured out behind them. Exhausted Union infantrymen broke ranks. An uncontrolled retreat towards Washington began, further confused by the panicked flight of horrified spectators. Army wagons, sutlers' teams, and private carriages choked the passage, tumbling against each other amid clouds of dust and sickening sights and sounds. Muskets and small arms were discharged along the way. Wounded soldiers pled for help. Horses running free exacerbated the human stampede." End quote. James McPherson, in his book Battle Cry of Freedom, has the first-hand account of a congressman who was there at the battle. He was one of these civilian spectators, and this is how he described what was happening. Quote, "Fleeing Union soldiers became entangled with panic-stricken civilians. Some congressmen tried in vain to stop wild-eyed soldiers, now miles from the battlefield, who had no intention of stopping short of the far side of the Potomac. We called to them, tried to tell them there was no danger, called them to stop, implored them to stand. We called them cowards, denounced them in the most offensive terms, put out our heavy revolvers, and threatened to shoot them, but all in vain. A cruel, crazy, mad, hopeless panic possessed them. The men were exhausted. Their mouths gaped, their lips cracked and blackened with the powder of the cartridges they had bitten off in the battle, their eyes starting in frenzy. No mortal ever saw such a mass of ghastly wretches." End quote. The Union soldiers had fought a long and difficult battle on the rolling hills of Manassas. They had performed bravely in their encounters with their enemy and were within a breath of achieving victory. And in just 30 minutes' time, everything changed. The First Battle of Manassas will be the most costly battle in the country's history up to that point. There are 2,700 Union casualties as a result of this battle. Almost 500 of those are dead. The Confederate casualties number around 2,000, with almost 400 of them being reported as dead. Before this battle, the widespread belief, and this is in both North and South, was that this war was going to be a short war with little cost in human life. And with almost 900 souls offered up as payment for participating in this war after only 12 hours from the first shots of the battle, the tragic reality of what lay in store for the country becomes crystal clear. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, make sure you never miss new ones by subscribing to the show on your podcast app of choice. And if you want to help us out with growing the show and enable us to bring you better content and more of it, then Brett and I ask you leave us a 5-star rating and a review. They really go a long way in helping us out. Stay up to date with everything from America Fog of War by connecting with us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. As always, Brett and I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay frosty.